There was a fatal contradiction in Germany that guaranteed Hitler would fail, and that was simply the predominance of the nobility in the military, because historically only members of the nobility were allowed to be officers, a tradition that was still in place right up until Hitler's election. This meant that many of his officers were born and bred into a tradition of polite discourse with the enemy, as evidenced by the flight of Rudolf Hess, and the notion that war was merely a gentleman's game was abhorrent to the Americans, who had no sympathy for anything having to do with the nobility after having seen them in action in the Great War. The German nobles carried a von in their name, meaning from, and having a von was a nobiliary particle indicating a noble patrilineality, and as soon as Hitler would die, his successor Dönitz appointed von Krosigk as the new Chancellor of Germany. And von Krosigk was not only born into German nobility, he'd been a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and in 1931 had worked in the German finance ministry and been responsible for paying war reparations to the British. Von Krosigk was still the finance minister of Germany at the end of Hitler's war, and had been since 1932, along with von Schleicher, while Himmler had been a simple common man like both Hitler and Keitel, not members of the nobility club. Because Hitler had purportedly decreed that Dönitz would succeed him after Bormann got Goering kicked out of the line of succession, it stood as fact that Dönitz and his friend von Krosigk preferred to do business with the noble class in Britain rather than with the American mongrels. Von Krosigk's full name was Johann Ludwig Lutz Graf Schwerin von Krosigk, and while many of the German nobles had been swept away after the 20th of July plot, which had made Himmler much more powerful, von Krosigk had remained in charge of laundering all the Nazis' stolen money, and he knew where nearly all the bodies were buried. Von Krosigk was a true believer in the solidarity of the nobility as opposed to the common mob, specifically communists and their Jew sympathizers. And the German nobility considered Monty to be among their own ranks, and Monty had just erected his tent smack dab in the middle of his own noble ancestral lands in Hanover. While Hitler was still alive in April of 1945, playing Wagner over the radio and exulting in the miracle of FDR's death, he certainly had needed a miracle, and Frederick the Great's Brandenburg reversal in 1761 had been just one of the many occult signs recognized by Nazis, such as the northern lights at Berchtesgaden appearing the night Hitler made a pact with Stalin. Miracles and supernatural signs in nature were intrinsic to the Nazi philosophy, with its loyalty to mystical spirits living in the ancient German forests, and the last-minute victory of Frederick the Great went right along with the idea the Germans had stuck in their heads that Monty would get to Berlin before the Russians, and there convince the Americans to join with the sons of the fatherland in fighting the Russian hordes, and the only impediment to more Germans surrendering that April were British troops refusing to take their surrender. If Hitler had chosen to leave the Führerbunker, it would have had to be the best-kept secret ever. And another idea had been that if Hitler were presumed dead, he could be reported to have died a hero's death on the battlefield, which would certainly keep up Germany's morale in resisting the Russians. And it was no matter that the Red Army had encircled Berlin in April, because there were many small three-man prop planes available to spirit away the Führer from any of the many grassy fields that were being used as airfields. The escape party had to make their move before the Russians became more entrenched, and even now they might have to dodge some small arms fire. Both Goering and Hitler had sworn loyalty to Hitler at his birthday party, and then immediately left, and Goering headed to Austria and reached the Obersalzberg on the 22nd of April, prepared to negotiate with the Americans, and they asked him to provide a document from Hitler giving Goering that authority. So Goering sent Hitler a telegram that was intercepted by Bormann, and Bormann read it aloud to Hitler in a negative tone of voice, and Hitler cut Goering off without a prayer. Bormann put out an order to have Goering shot on sight, and Hitler appointed Grand Admiral Dönitz as his successor, but that could change at the drop of a hat if something happened to Hitler, after which new declarations of succession could emerge from the Führerbunker. Chief Müller: "We received information from the Swiss that a criminal, a forger named Zwingelmann, was living in the vicinity of Chur in Switzerland, and had been approached by the British to forge German papers. Then the war came, and he was visited by British intelligence. He was proficient in German script, too, so they hired him. One of these attorneys had joined their naval intelligence, you see, and felt the specialist might further the British cause. Let me get back to him in a moment. The place was searched thoroughly by 4 very professional men for 5 hours. They found a great deal of material he was working on, and I think you might be interested to learn that along with forging the signatures of top officials of the German government, he also had the signatures and writing samples of some high-level American intelligence and diplomatic persons as well, and not to mention a good deal of the original paper from different agencies. He could have opened a stationery shop with his stock." Gestapo chief: "The 1948 interrogation of Heinrich Müller from secret U.S. intelligence files by Gregory Douglas of the New Mexico State University at Las Cruces, San Jose, California, R. James Bender Publishing, 1995, page 126. Himmler had gone in the opposite direction from Goering, heading to Hanover, and the British had finally made it to Lüneburg on the 18th of April and put up Monty's tent on the shore of the Elbe Lateral Canal, just an hour upriver from Hamburg, where anyone could come sailing in from the North Sea or from the Baltic through the Kiel Canal. Hamburg was 25 miles away from Lüneburg, and Lüneburg was 40 miles northeast of Bergen-Belsen, through which Monty had just marched. Albert Speer had gone to Hamburg after being in Berlin earlier in March, and Speer had come from an upper-class family, and as soon as Monty arrived in Lüneburg, Speer went back to the Führerbunker in Berlin on the 22nd of April, and left Berlin the following day to return to Hamburg on the 23rd of April. The Americans overran Flossenburg concentration camp as Speer was on his way back to Hamburg. And then the Americans reached Dachau, where they lined up a couple dozen camp guards against the wall and shot them, while the prisoners killed a couple dozen more with their bare hands. And the next day, on the 24th of April, while trying to stop Patton from reaching Prague, Günther Lützow lost his dogfight with 22 American B-26 Marauders and 16 P-47 Thunderbolts while flying his Messerschmitt 262 jet fighter. There was a meeting between Dönitz, Keitel, Jodl, and Himmler on the 27th of April at Rheinsberg, where Frederick the Great had lived 50 miles north of Berlin. And the following day, the BBC announced Himmler's willingness to surrender to Monty just as the Russian encirclement of Berlin was joined, cutting off the city of Berlin. Telephones could easily be tapped, so the most important meetings were made in person, and the Rheinsberg meeting had probably been at the Leichen Sanatorium, but it could have been at Rheinsberg because there was an airfield at Zwickau, 3 miles south of Rheinsberg, and a train ran regularly from Berlin to Rheinsberg, and from Rheinsberg thence to Hamburg. Because of Himmler's participation, it may very well have been at the Leichen Sanatorium, although it could also have been at Fürstenberg at OKW headquarters because of the presence of Keitel and Jodl. Fürstenberg was 10 miles east of Rheinsberg, and the Leichen Sanatorium was a further 7 miles into the woods. And the day after the Rheinsberg meeting, Himmler and Dönitz got on a plane to Flensburg that was on the Baltic side of the Danish peninsula, where they would move around freely for the next 25 days, wearing their Nazi uniforms and openly displaying their Nazi flags while having meetings and negotiating with the British. And this would go on until the Americans showed up to put an end to it on the 23rd of May. Speer claimed to have been present on the 23rd of April when Bormann received Goering's telegram. And Speer described the telegram as reasonable and helpful, and Speer said that Bormann had called it a coup. And Speer surmised that it had been Bormann's attempt to get Hitler to fly away to Austria to confront Goering in person, which had been Bormann's best try to get Hitler to escape from Berlin and thus keep Bormann in power as Hitler's most loyal servant. But it seemed that Speer had added this anecdote later as some foggy proof of his own attempt to get Hitler to leave the Führerbunker. Speer said that Bormann had brought in a map for the daily briefing that showed the Russians much farther away than they really were. But Speer had not attempted to correct him or warn Hitler of how close the Russians actually were. Speer had been using the airport at Rechlin, also called Lars. It was 20 miles north of Rheinsberg, and from there he could fly in and out of a suburb of Berlin called Gatow. The commandant was willing to have me taken in a training plane to Gatow, where 2 Storks, single-motored reconnaissance planes with low landing speed, would be held in readiness for the second lap of our journey. Inside the Third Reich, Memoirs by Albert Speer, translated from the German by Richard and Clara Winston and the Macmillan Company, 1970, page 565 and 6. To the surprise of the few drivers on the broad avenue, we landed just in front of the Brandenburg Gate. We stopped an army vehicle and had it drive us to the Chancellery. Memoirs by Albert Speer, page 566. Speer said that in the Führerbunker on the 23rd, he went to Eva Braun's room to drink champagne and eat candy and cake, and he claimed that she said that she and Hitler were going to commit suicide, and everyone who'd been at the bunker claimed to have been told that same story, relieving them all of any blame for not having tried to save him. And Speer left the Führerbunker at 3 a.m. and arrived back at Rechlin Air Base at dawn on the 24th, and would find out 6 days later that he'd been cut out of Hitler's will. Speer didn't want to drive back to Hamburg during the day on the 24th of April, for fear of being strafed, so he had to wait until evening, and while waiting at Rechlin, Speer heard that Himmler was 25 miles away at the Leichen Sanatorium, so Speer went to visit Himmler. We decided to visit him, landing in our Stork on a nearby field. Himmler was quite surprised to see me, and to make the situation even more grotesque, Dr. Gebhardt was also present. Memoirs by Albert Speer, page 576. Speer wrote that on the 24th of April, Himmler said, "I've already been in touch with various persons I mean to take into my cabinet. Keitel is coming to see me shortly." Perhaps Himmler assumed that I'd come to see him to wheedle a post in his new government. Finally, Himmler, after all, held out a faint prospect of my becoming a minister in his government. For my part, with some sarcasm, I offered him my plane so that he could pay a farewell visit to Hitler. But Himmler waved that aside. He had no time for that now, he said. Unemotionally, he explained, "Now I must prepare my new government, and besides, my person is too important for the future of Germany for me to risk the flight." The arrival of Keitel put an end to our conversation. On my way out, I heard the field marshal, in the same firm voice with which he so frequently addressed high-flown sentimental declarations to Hitler, now assuring Himmler of his unconditional loyalty and announcing that he was entirely at his disposal. That evening I returned to Hamburg. Memoirs by Albert Speer, page 576 and 7. Instead of Goering becoming the new Führer, Hitler had appointed Admiral Dönitz, and Dönitz told Himmler and his SS men to run and hide, or at least that's what he later told the Americans. Dönitz had his headquarters in Flensburg, because that's where the German Naval Academy was, and Dönitz was living on board a new ship named the Patria, along with the rest of his cabinet. Dönitz had started out during the Great War as the watch officer on the submarine U-39, and had been commander of the submarine UB-68 that was sunk 1 month before the armistice, and while most of his crew had survived, Dönitz had been made a prisoner of the British on Malta, and had been taken as a POW to a camp near Sheffield in England, where he would be their guest until July of 1920. The Naval Academy at Flensburg was a beautiful place called the Red Castle by the sea, and the Kaiser had built it to resemble the Teutonic castle of Malbork, built in Poland in the 13th century, and Malbork Castle was 25 miles inland from the port of Danzig, on a branch of the Vistula River. The castle at Malbork was one of the Ordensburg or order castles in which the Nazis trained their elite, and Malbork Castle was the largest brick building in Europe. Keitel and Jodel's OKW headquarters at Fürstenberg was called the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, and Gotthard had taken Felix Steiner's best troops away to dig in on the Seelow Heights east of Berlin. And that had been what prompted Hitler on the 22nd of April to rage against his disloyal generals, because Hitler was expecting news from Monty about the peace plan as soon as Steiner's 2nd Naval Infantry arrived from Hanover, but the road to Fürstenberg was cut off by the Russians, and Steiner could no longer get through to Berlin. The Steiner plan had been in full swing, and the 2nd Naval Detachment was heading back to Berlin after being trained and briefed by the British on how to spirit Hitler away from the Führerbunker to a radio station in Hamburg. But the Steiner plan had been thwarted at Verden when the 53rd Welsh accidentally ran into the 2nd Naval Detachment on the 10th and 11th of April, resulting in heavy losses on both sides, and that had happened just as the American 9th was reaching the Elbe. The town of Verden was 25 miles away from a major POW camp holding 17,000 mostly British POWs, and Monty's orders to march to Lübeck had been laid aside by the British Army over the immediate necessity of freeing their brothers, since it was clear that Germany had already lost the war, and the only thing worse than the fog at the beginning of a war is the chaos at the end of one. When Speer told Hitler that Steiner had refused to attack Zhukov because he had inadequate troops and no tanks and was outnumbered 10-1, Hitler was raging over the fact that Steiner's 2nd Naval Detachment had not yet arrived from Hanover. And Speer said, quote, "During February and March of 1945, Hitler occasionally hinted that he was contacting the enemy by various means, but he would never go into details." Memoirs by Albert Speer, page 504. Hitler had his 2 best men out there trying to make a deal. Himmler with Monty and Goering with the Americans, so keeping that road open to Fürstenberg had not been too much to ask of Steiner, an SS man of the highest caliber, and Speer had still been able to come and go safely from Berlin on the 23rd of April, but the clock was ticking, and time was of the essence. Speer returned to Hamburg with Hitler's agreement to put Dönitz in charge, having convinced Hitler that there was no way Goering could get the Americans to fight the Russians, and that their only hope lay with Dönitz making a deal with Monty. And as soon as Speer left for Hamburg, Hitler wrote his last will and testament, removing Himmler from power. Himmler had been in Lübeck on the 23rd of April, and when Speer returned from the Führerbunker, Himmler met that day with the Swedish consul and purportedly told them that Hitler would be dead within the next few days. But he could have said anything. And what is known is that Himmler told the Swedes to tell Ike that Himmler was ready to surrender. But Ike refused to even read the written proposal, so the British newspapers and radio that had reported on this separate peace with Himmler must have been a British made-up story in hopes of making Stalin angry at the Americans, but the Russians knew better than to believe the British press, and Stalin publicly stated that there was no disagreement between him and the Americans, and the war continued without a hitch. Churchill even called the new American president, Harry Truman, by transatlantic telephone on the 25th of April to tell him about Himmler's offer of a separate peace. But Truman soundly rejected the idea, and Speer brought newspapers to the Führerbunker on the 22nd of April to show to Hitler, newspapers with photos of the mountain of starved corpses at Bergen-Belsen, and Speer told Hitler that the SS would not survive the Bergen-Belsen news reports because of those photos, unless Himmler were made to carry the blame for all of it. It could be said that Hitler didn't know what had been going on in the camps, and that it had all been Himmler's doing. And as Speer and Hitler were talking, the British were making movies of the German guards at Bergen-Belsen, stating that it was all done under Himmler's orders. Speer might even have brought some movie footage of the masses of skeletal bodies being tossed into open pits to show to Hitler, in order to make the point that there could be no separate peace that would stop the Russians unless Himmler were thrown under the bus. And in the past 90 days, since the British had bombed Magdeburg, as soon as the Russians surrounded Budapest, when the Bulge was officially dead, the toll in the camps had taken an indescribable turn for the worse, with starvation and disease sweeping through them like Gotterdammerung itself. The newspaper photos showed corpses stacked like cordwood, or lying in huge heaps out in the open, unburied and naked, and in the face of these pictures there was no way the world would allow the Germans to rearm in order to fight the oncoming Russians, although Dönitz claimed to have believed that the workers in the German camps had been told they would get better treatment if they agreed to work for the good of Germany. But his stated opinion to that effect was not only unwelcome, it simply didn't fly. Without the Americans, it was probable that the Bolshevik horde would completely take over all of Europe and then hop on over to England, and that evocation would be the final plea to the Americans that it was in their best interest to stand up to the Red Army, or England would be lost along with all the Lend-Lease debt owed to America. But the Americans and the Russians had linked up at Torgau on the 25th, when Monty was bogged down with the Bergen-Belsen cleanup. There was a real possibility that the Russians could make it to Lübeck before the British. So Ike had given Monty more American troops, but it hadn't helped Monty move forward any faster. From the port of Hamburg on the North Sea to the Bay of Lübeck on the Baltic was only 40 miles overland, and from Lübeck one could sail to Flensburg, 80 miles to the north, and the truth was that Ike hadn't given Monty more troops to help him make forward progress more quickly, but to keep an eye on him, and Ike's men sent steady reports back to American headquarters. Had the Bulge succeeded, Hodge's army would have been wiped out, and Bradley's army would have been destroyed, and Patton would have been forced to march back through Paris in disgrace. Himmler would have become the new German head of state, and the SS the internationally accepted police force of peacetime Germany, and in Monty's separate peace, he would blame the Americans for losing the war, and send them all back to America, owing immense war reparations. But for the simple fact that the Arnhem Bridge had remained in the hands of German generals who had no longer been following Hitler's orders. Chief Müller. The intellectual classes, and especially the military class, always detested him, Hitler. The military always ruled Germany, even after the war, and they were, and still are, very caste-conscious. They threw out the Kaiser when it suited them. These were mostly land-owning squires from East Prussia who all knew each other, had all been in the socially acceptable regiments before the war, so they sabotaged him when they could and grumbled in their messes and at their hunt meetings. These men may have been brilliant staff officers, but they always thought in military terms, strictly military terms, and never considered anything else at all. Many of these officers joined the conspiracy when the war began to go against them. They were content to remain inactive as long as Hitler gave them marshal's batons and high decorations, but eventually that wore off. Also, as I said, many of the older, high-ranking officers sabotaged Hitler's plans. I must say that while I am not a military specialist, I know that Hitler was far more often right in military matters than they were. He would issue an order, and because some general was offended by Hitler's person, this officer would not obey it directly. If a disaster happened, he and his friends would blame it all on Hitler, and they would lie to his face very often. That was never a good idea. It got so bad that Hitler had to have all his conferences recorded by stenographers. He simply could not trust his military people. Gestapo Chief, page 144 and 5. The Russians launched their offensive on Berlin on the 16th of April, and von Manteuffel held out on the Silo Heights until the first Belarusian and the first Ukrainian broke through 9 days later on the 25th of April, although the Russians had decimated them in the first 3 days, and von Manteuffel's survivors retreated to surrender to the British at Hagenau, 30 miles east of Lüneburg, on the 3rd of May, while the Russians were bringing down Berlin. And von Manteuffel's surrender to Monty delivered 300,000 highly motivated troops into Monty's hands. The British would deliver von Manteuffel over to the Americans in 1946, so he could become an army historian, and 3 days after the Russians had overrun the Silo Heights, Keitel was riding along the roads north of Berlin on the 28th of April when he met the army of the Vistula, who were 120 miles north, marching away from Berlin instead of marching towards Berlin to save Hitler, as Keitel and Jodl had ordered. Keitel found Gotthard on a road near New Brandenburg the next day, on the 29th of April, and Keitel and Gotthard exchanged words, and von Manteuffel said they were headed to New Brandenburg to stop the Russians from marching towards Hanover. Keitel told Gotthard to go ahead to New Brandenburg with von Tippelskirch as the new commander of the army of the Vistula, and von Tippelskirch used that promotion as a means to surrender the next day to the Americans near Ludwigslust, 15 miles southwest of the British and 100 miles west of New Brandenburg. Hitler immediately heard about it and promoted Kurt Student to command the army of the Vistula, so he could surrender to the British instead of to the Americans, and Kurt Student had been at Arnhem waiting for Monty during Market Garden, and while Speer was supposed to be getting the Steiner plan ready to rescue Hitler, Himmler had been busy with Monty, getting ready to blame Hitler for everything. The Flensburg government were keeping their fingers crossed, hoping Monty would deal directly with Dönitz and his Flensburg government as soon as Berlin fell and Hitler were removed from the picture. And while Himmler had been Monty's main man, when Hitler's last will and testament, signed by both Goebbels and Bormann on the 28th of April, in the wee hours after midnight, declared that Himmler was removed from power, that put a wrench in the works, so Dönitz just ignored it. In Berlin 1 day later, Goebbels would die along with his wife and children, and Bormann would disappear. The body of the Goebbels had barely been burned, so how were the Hitler and Eva corpses charred beyond recognition if the attempt to cremate them had happened at the same time that Magna Goebbels and her husband had walked up the stairs after giving cyanide to their kids, and then stood watching Hitler's body burning while she and her husband took cyanide? No matter. The trick for Dönitz was to string Himmler along, since Himmler was keeping a kennel of personal SS assassins that frequently needed to be thrown a bone. And while the Hitler suicide story made it possible to carry on the business of making peace with the British without anyone having to bother searching for Hitler, it may have been whispered that Hitler could be brought back in a miraculous return as soon as Monty gave the German POWs back their arms and restored to them the objective of crushing the Russians in the East. Everyone who escaped the Führerbunker described Hitler's handwriting as having deteriorated, maintaining that was why the signature on his last will and testament was so unlike his usual signature, and they all swore that they had begged both Eva and Hitler to escape from Berlin, except for Speer, who claimed in his memoirs that he'd told Hitler to stay and die in Berlin rather than running away. Bormann had been the manager of a large farm and was an experienced genius car mechanic. And he'd been in charge of the Nazis' relief fund, so he had access to plenty of money, and Bormann had been responsible for building roads and warehouses and various SS facilities. And he'd been in charge of the construction of the Berghof in Obersalzberg, and whoever wanted to get through to Hitler had to go through Bormann. 3 copies of Hitler's last will and testament had been witnessed and signed and sent forth from the bunker in 3 different directions at dawn on the 29th, and then Bormann had cabled Dönitz with the details that day on the 29th and again on the 30th. Nobody bothered to ask why Goebbels would have killed himself if the Führer had just appointed him as Chancellor and had named Bormann as Reichsleiter party minister, both men now needed to keep Germany's seat at the table for bargaining terms when the war ended, and why would the Russians report that they could not find Hitler? The 3 people who survived the fall of Berlin and could offer eyewitness accounts of Hitler's purported death all gave different versions, and they said that the 2 bodies brought out of Hitler's study had been wrapped in blankets before they were carried out of the room to be taken upstairs and burned with gasoline, although embellishments over the years were added to make the stories sound more credible, such as Eva Braun's dress blowing in the wind until the gasoline poured on it made the fabric stop flapping, or that when Eva confessed to wanting to die with Hitler, she'd been wearing a flimsy nightgown. When the Russians showed up, they looted the place but had no cameras with them, and 2 weeks later, when the war was over and cameras were brought to the Führerbunker, the ventilation tower and the private entrance had been completely destroyed. The Russians had found 5 empty 5-gallon gasoline cans sitting by the main entrance that may just as well have been used to put gas into vehicles rather than having been used to burn corpses, and the Goebbels family was supposed to have killed themselves as soon as Hitler was dead. But there were 3 different versions of that story, one of which was that the other people in the bunker had killed the Goebbels before escaping with Hitler, who'd been hiding in a closet. Bormann never mentioned Hitler's suicide when he sent out telegrams after Hitler had purportedly killed himself. And Speer was the only one telling the story of a suicide. And in a previous telegram the week before, Dönitz had told Hitler that he would do everything in his power to come to Hitler's rescue in Berlin, and Speer was the sole architect of the Steiner Plan. When it became known that Goering was telling the Americans in Vienna that Hitler wasn't even alive and that Bormann was calling the shots from the Führerbunker, they made a video of what was supposed to be Hitler on the 25th of April, showing him giving medals to Hitler Youth in the courtyard of the Führerbunker to prove to the peace negotiators that he was still alive, ready and available to rally the troops for the upcoming pushback against the Russians. Arthur Axmann said that he'd seen Bormann killed in Berlin the day they fled the Führerbunker after Hitler died, and Axmann was the most highly decorated Nazi who'd been the head of the Hitler Youth. And Axmann had retrieved Hitler's pistol used in Hitler's death and would hide out until December, working to rescue Nazis for the Odessa rat line until the Americans found him and put Axmann on the war criminal list. Axmann had lost his right arm on the Eastern Front, and after his trial, he would be put in prison for 3 years and 3 months and made to pay a fine equal to half the value of his home, and it was because of Axmann that Dönitz found out it was safe to go to Monty's tent on the 4th of May because Axmann swore to have personally seen Bormann killed during the escape from the Führerbunker, and so Bormann was no longer a threat to the Flensburg holdout government and their negotiations with the British. On the morning of the 30th of April, Monty's plan was leaked to the London press, and Hitler was dead by nightfall. And the Louisville Courier-Journal's headline on the 5th of May would say that Monty had taken 1 million prisoners in Hanover the day before, and 1 million Germans in Italy and Austria had already given themselves up to the British, which Stalin surely considered an act of treachery because the Germans were still shooting at Russians. Hitler had heard the British broadcast on the 28th of April announcing Himmler's willingness to surrender, and when Hitler realized he'd been left out of the loop, Dönitz received a telegram from Hitler the next day, on the 29th of April, ordering Dönitz to arrest Himmler immediately, and the telegram had been sent from Bormann, but instead Dönitz went directly to Himmler's headquarters in Lübeck on the 30th of April, and then they went together to Plön, which was a very nice place, 30 miles north of Lübeck. At Plön, they were all supposed to wait for Monty to get to Lübeck with the surrender documents, but Monty called it off when Berlin surrendered to the Russians on the 2nd of May. Because the Russians were saying that Hitler had escaped. And instead of getting to Lübeck, Monty set up a surrender ceremony in his tent at Lüneburg for the 4th of May, rather than going all the way to Lübeck. Lüneburg was 70 miles south of Lübeck, and Lüneburg was the best Monty could do because half his troops had peeled off, either to rehabilitate concentration camp survivors or to liberate British POWs, and Monty was also struggling because his separate peace plan to help Germans fight Russia was contingent upon getting the Americans out of the way. When Hitler died, Dönitz and Keitel had to listen to Himmler at Plön, suggesting that they all move to Prague where they could negotiate with the Americans instead of with Monty, because Patton and his Third Army had almost reached Prague, and Himmler well knew that Patton did not trust the Russians. But Dönitz insisted on sticking to the plan to meet with Monty because Dönitz had found out that Ike ordered Patton to halt outside Prague, leaving the city to the Russians, and that meant Ike was not interested in fighting the Red Army, so Germany's only hope was to make a deal with Monty. And Monty's mission did not include stopping for social services at Bergen-Belsen. Ike had ordered Patton to march towards Austria on the 16th of April, 2 days after promoting him to full general. And the Third Army's final offensive began on the 19th of April, and on the 20th, Patton was flying in his Piper Cub when he saw tracers being fired from a Spitfire, and it made a second pass while continuing to fire at Patton. But on the third pass, the Spitfire crashed, and the pilot of the Spitfire had been a Polish officer in the RAF who didn't want Poland given to the Russians, although the British claimed he had mistaken Patton's Cub for a German Fiesler-Storch. Despite the documents signed in Monty's tent on the 4th of May, Jodl heard that Ike was demanding that Germans in the East surrender also to the Russians, and Jodl went to talk him out of it on the 5th, but Ike replied that if the Germans didn't stop fighting Russians by the 7th, the Americans would close all lines of surrender and resume bombing the Germans, so Jodl sent a telegram to Dönitz, who asked for a 48-hour delay, hoping to buy more time for Germans to surrender west to the Americans. But Ike just said no. All the newspapers reported that Hitler had been killed in battle while fighting from his command post, and that he died fighting the Russians, and each headline in every paper was coupled with the announcement of Dönitz's succession as Germany's leader and his vow to continue the war against Russia. Not a single newspaper said that Hitler had committed suicide, and Dönitz went on the radio with extended narratives about Hitler having died the death of a hero, and Dönitz gave his solemn promise that the war against Bolshevism would keep going, while another headline in all the papers had Churchill hinting that peace was at hand. Utah's Salt Lake City Tribune ran a story on the front page of their Wednesday paper on the 2nd of May, heralding Churchill hints vital news on war by Saturday, promises Commons if information of importance breaks, he will interrupt session for announcement. But the article clearly stated that Churchill never used the word peace, but only information or news. Another story titled Dönitz succeeds as Reich leader, Führer dies fighting Russians, German people informed, Admiral urges continuance of war, said that the Russians were calling the purported death of Hitler a fascist trick. Another headline on the Salt Lake City Tribune's front page read, Rus close on Hitler's death site. Expect to discover Führer's double amid Berlin ruins. And all these headlines in Utah had come from the London AP. The newspapers had a field day reporting Monty's partial surrender on the 4th of May, and it went on all throughout the weekend. And Friday had been the day of Monty's signing ceremony in his tent in Hanover, and he was written up as the hero who had ended the war and made it possible to stop the Russians now. And despite all the media hysteria, Ike would present the world with the reality of Monday morning on the 7th of May, when the Germans in the East were forced to surrender to the Russians, and all the carefully laid plans of the British were as though they had never been. On Hitler's birthday in Berlin, on the 20th of April, both Himmler and Goering had been told by Hitler to go forth and negotiate with whomsoever they pleased in order to get help to stop the Red Army, and Hitler had promised he would be waiting in the Führerbunker to see which of them succeeded first. And on Hitler's birthday, 4 German planes in Hanover had attacked the camp at Bergen-Belsen, damaging the water supply and killing 3 British medical orderlies, but that serious inconvenience had not been enough for the locals to permit the Germans to take the camp back, because the photos in the newspapers had stopped everyone cold, and plenty of enlisted personnel were suddenly given top priority in taking care of business at Bergen-Belsen rather than continuing to fight the war. Some historians maintained that Hitler had not at all been interested in suicide, despite what Speer was telling everyone, and Speer had trusted that Hitler would be spirited out to safety by Steiner's 2nd Naval Task Force, and when Speer got back to Hamburg from the Führerbunker, he was spreading the suicide story to cover Hitler's escape after rehearsing it with some of those remaining in the Führerbunker, and the charade had included a body double being burnt up with gasoline in the courtyard. The suicide story had been so convincing to Goebbels that he took cyanide after killing his wife and their beautiful kids, and then Bormann killed Krebs and Bergdorf before escaping with the others on the 1st of May. Another version was that Krebs spoke Russian, and Goebbels sent him out on the 1st of May with a letter of partial surrender, but the Russian commander had refused to accept it because he'd heard that Hitler had escaped, and therefore Goebbels' surrender letter was just a trick, and Krebs returned to the Führerbunker, and that's why Goebbels had died, because the Russians had refused his offer, and then Krebs and some others were said to have killed themselves, while Bormann left the bunker with 2 people an hour before midnight, one of whom was Hitler's pilot, after which the rest of the occupants scattered in 10 different groups. The Führerbunker was built in 2 separate parts and had 30 rooms with more than one exit, including an emergency exit into the garden from Hitler's rooms. And Hitler had kept a large portrait of Frederick the Great hanging on the wall. Q. You state without reservation that, of your personal knowledge, Adolf Hitler left Berlin on the 22nd of April, 1945. Is that correct? Chief Müller: It is. Of my personal knowledge, he left Berlin alive on that date. Q: He went to Spain, to Barcelona, of your personal knowledge? Chief Müller: Yes, of my personal knowledge, he did. Q: You have full knowledge of a double left in the Chancellery area after Hitler's flight? Chief Müller: I do. Gestapo Chief, page 208. Chief Müller: It came to my attention in 1941, through the Gestapo duty station in Breslau, that a man working in a printing plant there was an exact double for Hitler. I had the man photographed, and when I examined the pictures, I should say that the resemblance was remarkable. He had no moustache, and his hair was cut differently, but the similarity was astonishing. We had the man brought to Berlin, and I interviewed him. He was born in Austria, in the Waldviertel district. He was from the same Silip family, and they were distant relatives of Hitler. There were quite a few people in that area that looked like Hitler. A lot of long-time intermarriages. He never knew Hitler, and the family moved up into the land above Prague, at Gastorf. After the war, this became a part of Czechoslovakia, and the family moved again up to Breslau. After 1938, most of the family moved back because it was now a part of the Protectorate, but this man stayed in Breslau to work. He was shorter, younger, and a little heavier, but the head and features were very, very close. His accent had some Czech overtones, but that was all corrected as we went along. Also, he smoked and had to give that up. Q: How often was he used? Chief Müller: Only at the end, except for a few appearances in 1944, just brief appearances, after the 20th of July. Gestapo Chief, page 193. Chief Müller: There were two ways in and out of the bunker complex. One was through the Chancellery, and the other was an exit into the garden of the Chancellery. Hitler's personal bunker was at a lower level than the larger upper bunker, and it alone had an emergency exit into the garden. Hitler got everyone used to his going up the stairs with his dog, and would take the dog for a walk in the garden at night. Most of the time, the garden was heavily guarded by the RSD, and there were dogs and lights at night. When Hitler went up, naturally they turned off the floodlights and removed the dogs. It was just for a short time, and Rattenhuber, who was on the inside of this business, was responsible for all of the security precautions. It was a very simple matter for Hitler to come up at night for his walk, with Linga or alone. He left through another exit from the garden, and the double went back down into the bunker with another sheepdog from the kennel. All this happened in my presence, so I can assure you, I am not guessing about it, we kept the double out of view as much as we could. There were a number of visits from people really not close to Hitler, but as few as possible. Goebbels and Linga were the best help in this matter. I remember Bormann saying to me in a very worried way, "The chief looks very different, Müller. Do you think he might have had some kind of a stroke?" I said I didn't think so. Bormann kept saying we should all go south as soon as possible, and I replied that a helicopter would land in the garden at any time and take everyone away. Gestapo Chief, page 203. Chief Müller: No, the body is not that of Hitler. Why? The socks are mended. Hitler would never have mended socks. Nonsense, everyone has mended socks. The body has only one testicle. Hitler had two. A better point. Fingerprints? None to compare with. Now we come to the real matter. Not the same ears. Q. Ears? Chief Müller: Before fingerprints became a means of identification, they used to look at the ears to identify persons. No two pair are the same. I noticed that the double's ears were not exactly the same, but similar enough, and who looks at ears? A good photograph will prove the point at once. So this wasn't Hitler after all. Very angry people from Moscow, very nervous police officials in Berlin. Instead of a medal, they might get a shot in the back of the neck. What is to be done with the fake body? Comrade Stalin is asked. Destroy it at once. Gestapo Chief, page 195. One of the 10 groups escaping from the Führerbunker included Helmuth Wiedling, who headed to the subway and then joined hundreds of people sheltering in the Schultheiss Patzenhofer brewery. And the following day, on the 2nd of May, Weidling ordered the complete surrender to the Russians of all German forces still in Berlin. And the Russians took anybody into custody who might have seen Hitler dead and sent them to prison in Moscow for interrogation. And the Russians found out that over half of the people who had left the Führerbunker on the 1st of May had either committed suicide or had been suicided before they could be asked about Hitler's death. Weidling never saw Hitler and Eva dead, but had outlined in a report to Hitler the escape plan on the 26th, and then returned to the nearby air raid shelter where Weidling had his headquarters, and from there he continued his work defending Hitler and preparing the escape to Walter Wenck's 12th Army, 13 miles south of the Führerbunker. When Weidling came to get Hitler as the sun went down on the 30th of April, he was met by Bormann, who told him that Hitler was dead and that the body had been burned up by gasoline. And Weidling was told that nobody was to know this except Stalin. That was their plan. And Stalin was to be led to believe that the Führer was dead, and they had a couple of half-burned corpses with one of Hitler's dental bridges placed by the charred skull to prove it. Weidling wrote a surrender order that began with the statement that Hitler had committed suicide, and he gathered 100 German soldiers around the front of the Bendler Block building where the 20th of July coup plot had been hatched, and in whose courtyard the Valkyrie conspirators had been shot, and the last of Hitler's army marched across the same bridge of the Landwehr Canal where 25 years earlier the Grand Duchess Anastasia had tried to kill herself by jumping into the water, and Hitler's war was finally over just as soon as Monty could be convinced that it was time to give up and go home.